Thanks so much for joining us. This is the session on autonomous finance, building the risk, data, and execution layer for digital assets. My name is Ben Fong. I am the head of business development at Berkeley Skydeck, which, as you may know, is the premier accelerator at UC Berkeley. We accelerate over 250 startups a year and all across AI and other topics. But happy to moderate this panel today. Our speaker is Omer Goldberg, who is the founder and CEO of Chaos Labs. And he's going to be talking to us a little bit about finance and AI. And Omer, would you like to give a quick introduction about yourself before we dive in?
Hi, Ben. Thanks for the intro. I'm Omer, founder and CEO at Chaos. Started Chaos in 2021. Since then, we've risen to become the global leader in on-chain risk for financial blockchain applications. We've processed over 5 trillion across lending markets, derivative markets, and different trading applications with zero bad debt. Really, our core innovation was taking something which used to be a heavily manual kind of consultant-based approach and building an automated cloud platform driven by what started as our own AI and machine learning models, mostly quantitative kind of in nature, and let's call it like the previous generation of AI models, and started really integrating language models early, which has brought us to where we are today, and excited to talk about the technology, the advances, and how it applies to finance and more broadly for anyone building today in the space.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. Really, really interesting background. And I'd love to kind of dive into kind of how you decided on the solution, especially in particular, like what was the moment that made you realize that financial AI was being framed this narrowly, especially around, not necessarily chat interfaces or co-pilots, but orchestration across risk, data, and execution?
Yeah, so maybe to kind of provide the requisite framing and context, I'll take a step back and really talk about like the philosophy with which we started the company and how it met where we are today as an industry in AI and machine learning. So before Chaos, I was at Meta for a little bit over 4 years, working across Instagram, Facebook, and several other projects. And people really know Meta as this consumer brand, but what far fewer people understand is how data-driven the culture is. So whether you are building a consumer-facing feature or product, or you're doing optimization or tweaking the ML recommendation algorithm, everything is done with A/B testing. So very, very rigorous data science discipline. Whether you're an engineer, product manager, marketer, you need to prove with data, with numbers, that you're actually advancing the product and not causing regressions anywhere. It's probably one of the most kind of lucrative revenue generating surfaces on the internet today. As such, everything is instrumented, and it's very rare that any product or any feature, any development is up and to the right on everything. So there are always trade-offs. This kind of discipline in early 2020, when DeFi started kicking off, really made me look at the space differently. At the time, it was really the first generation of on-chain financial protocols. All of these protocols had many financial parameters, some even thousands of them, and they were all being kind of set based on sometimes better intuition, sometimes worse intuition. And just looking at that from the background that I had, it was very clear to me that this was an optimization problem. And we started building our, at the time, agent-based simulations, which had a very different meaning than what it has today. At the time, really broadly across quant, there are some pockets that do some type of like natural language processing, sentiment analysis, but primarily the main tools that were used were time series forecasting and just different types of regression models, a little bit of neural nets, but really everything is like the inputs were mostly quantitative at the time. Around GPT-3, we became very heavy users, which led to folks at OpenAI investing in the last round. And at first thought it would be really simple to integrate a lot of this unstructured, very valuable data into the models. But with the same excitement and speed in which we started integrating it, we also realized that at the end, this is a statistical model. It's non-deterministic. On one hand, it did a lot of great things. On the other hand, a lot was left to be desired. Andrei Karpathy calls it the jagged intelligence. So there would be like these pockets of intelligence which were impressive, but really in an enterprise setting, in a setting that's as unforgiving as finance, good enough just doesn't make the cut. And the tail in which the model hallucinates or gets things wrong can be disastrous and really kind of cause a lot more damage than all the utility that it provides. So kind of the constraints and the requirements when you're working in production, when you're working in finance, are very different. And that's when our research team and engineering team really started investing heavily about 2.5 years ago in understanding what are the type of harnesses, what are the types of environments that we can build to really give us the confidence we need in order to go to production and ultimately manage trillions of flow across different instruments that we are deployed across.
Amazing. Yeah, really interesting to hear your background. You said at Meta, you're very data-driven, and then in kind of working with financial data and also the new models, you kind of started to tackle more unstructured data. So it sounds like you were able to adapt that mindset to additional data sets, even ones that aren't quite as quantitative.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think everyone today across any industry is really kind of tackling, they're running into the same kind of challenges that we run into. It doesn't matter if you're in finance or cyber or defense or any other just enterprise setting where you have like an SLA and things move fast. So I think on one hand, what the world is, everyone is seeing the promise. Very few have deployed it successfully in production across high stakes domains. I think primarily what we're seeing today is obviously kind of chatbots and customer success bots, which is great. And we're heading in the right direction, but there's still a lot of technology to develop in order to see it deployed broadly across those use cases.
Yeah, definitely. Kind of on the topic of kind of chatbots, I think a lot of people hear, financial AI and they think of research copilots and chat interfaces, but why does that framing break down so quickly once we have real money on the line, especially in digital asset markets, do you think?
It's a great question. I think that, look, when we're talking about general kind of frontier models, they're trained on a lot of data, but to simplify the conversation, we can say it's basically the internet. I think since the early versions of GPT-2 and 3, it's far more than the common crawler website, and they've since licensed a bunch of data. But a lot of that data is just really not relevant for your domain. And that manifests itself in a couple of ways. So A, you're running inference on a really large model, which very quickly, if you're running inference at scale, makes it cost prohibitive. Can also make it to a certain extent slower. And it could also just confuse the model as it has all these biases and prerequisites that are baked into it. So that's, I think, just to start things off. But then when you look more deeply into these models that are being used primarily as like these chatbots, they all have knowledge cutoffs, right? So they're all trained to a specific date. Anyone who's used these models a little bit may have run into like asking queries on current events and the model responding with something to the extent of, I'm unfamiliar with the events after a certain date. Please provide the requisite context. So really the workaround for this is connecting the agent and providing it with like a web search tool, which is great. But taking that a step further, it's querying Google. So what do you get when you query Google? So by definition, Google is serving to you documents which have been indexed, which means they're stale. They could be stale by a few minutes. They could be stale by several days. And then when you kind of project this onto any industry that depends on real-time information, that is not good enough, right? You don't want to make real-time decisions on information that's stale. Taking that one step even further, in the domain of finance, but also in the domain of cyber and potentially medical and a lot of other critical industries, those public search engines don't even index the information that you necessarily care about. So if we hone in on the example of finance, you can't ask Google what the global open interest is across every single options market. You can't ask it where cascading liquidations begin, where do they end. what is the float of this asset across every market that it's traded at globally. All of these inputs that you need for finance, you can't even get. So then one might say, okay, well, we can set up an MCP server and we can make this data available at runtime, which in itself is not a trivial task. But then you run into, again, the limitations of language models. So as the name suggests, language models are great at language. They're not so great at mathematics and precise computation, even though they might sound very confident when they respond to you. So if you're just going to connect it to an API that's going to provide time series data, again, you're going to blow up the context window of the agent and confuse it, depending on how large that time series or quantitative data is or table. And B, you won't be able to rely on the results. So really, like, our approach has always been, but especially since kind of the mainstream advent of language models, is using the best model for the task. And when we talk about chaos AI, it's not a singular large language model that's trained. It sits behind a router with an orchestrator and different workflows that provide that level of determinism, that harness all of the risk checks. And we vary with a lot of discretion, decide what we will route to a language model and what we'll route to different models that we've developed over the years.
Interesting. Yeah, so it sounds like there's a number of challenges, including being able to search for the right information, but also where to get the data, how to structure that data, and some of the kind of models to be able to analyze that data. That's something, a lot of different.
Analyze it's everything you just mentioned, and it's also like, obviously these models are trained to and get rewarded in training for pleasing the end user. So they're not always the most forthcoming when they're challenged with a problem that they don't have the data for. Also, a lot of the things that you're doing in your enterprise, the model was never trained on, so it doesn't know your best practices, your guardrails, all of these other things. So you need to be very, very careful when you're using it. And you could think of it sort of like as an employee who you onboarded yesterday, who's a smart PhD, knows kind of general information well, but doesn't know anything about your business. So you wouldn't throw them into the ring without like an onboarding period. And it's the same thing for these models and agents.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that kind of leads me to my next question, and you've kind of answered it a little bit, but just in terms of what are the limitations of these frontier models in practice? I mean, I think you mentioned wanting to please the user, trading on your own info. Some other topics that I thought about was time series reasoning, hedging logic, liquidation safe exits, execution under stress. I'm just kind of curious, are there any other areas where you see the frontier models still lacking?
Yeah, I mean, there are a ton. And by the way, like, I'll preface this by saying that I am extremely bullish on the technology and where it's going, but just also acknowledging the current state. So I think before we even kind of go back to talk about the quality of the output, there's just, from an infrastructure perspective, there's the inference, there's the latency. In the end, there's a global shortage right now across the AI supply chain. Companies are fighting tooth and nail to secure that compute and inference. And if you're not able to kind of secure massive inference deals and buy that compute upfront, you're basically being served by an availability basis. So when there are bursts in usage, suddenly, if you need a 1 second SLA, that's really hard to kind of guarantee. And all of the providers struggle with this. When they're met with this, and we see this all the time, they may do things like reducing the amount of reasoning tokens, which in turn further degrade the quality of the responses. So today, and over years, there will be a build out and the supply chain will become stronger. But just without even talking about the quality of the response, there are a lot of realities as it pertains to the compute availability that make it difficult for everyone to secure what they need when they need it. And if you're doing anything time sensitive or latency sensitive, that's almost a non-starter. So you still do need to have like your own kind of resourcing available during times like that. And the things you mentioned, tables, just any tables, computations, time series data. If you're throwing that into ChatGPT and banking on it, you're going to have a bad time. Just a query that we were playing with if you think earlier this week, we were demoing in the company was putting a time series of open close on a stock over the past year, and then asking ChatGPT how many days it traded under $100, let's say, and you asked it 3 different times, you got 3 different responses. So there's a lot of, once you look under the hood, you start benchmarking, you start evaluating, but you realize that there are things that they're amazing for today. There's things that they will be amazing for in the future, but between now and then, there's a lot to be built.
Yep, makes sense. Yeah, and I definitely can understand that the stakes are very high for financial companies in terms of timing and also accuracy. So that makes sense to me. Now moving on to this idea of autonomous finance and financial orchestration. I'm kind of curious, when you hear that term, financial orchestration, what does that mean in a digital asset context for a fund manager, a treasury team, exchange, or a protocol operator?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that's being thrown around a lot today in the industry. When we think about, or when I think about autonomous finance, I think mostly about the use case of managing a portfolio, what that looks like today, and what it could look like in the future. So, a, you know, the vast majority of people today still don't have access to really financial services. So that they're either completely unserved or underserved. And really today, only like a select kind of demographic have access to things like a private wealth manager. Um, but if you've had the opportunity to work with them, what you'll quickly see is that it's mostly picking up the phone, speaking to your manager, for them understanding what your time horizons are, your financial goals, your risk appetite, your appetite for volatility, how liquid you need to be, and basically crafting a policy or a plan in accordance to that. And today, a lot of this can be done by an agent already, right? So you
Hmm.
don't need to necessarily call a banker and kind of pick stocks and then confirm that the orders were sent, and then ask for all of these statements to be sent your way and reconcile them. So a lot of that can be done already today. So I think the future of that is, if today only a select demographic have access to these type of financial services, it's something that's going to be broadly democratized. There's no reason for it not to be. And then when you speak about blockchains, the great things about blockchains are that they are permissionless. um, as an industry, we have today a lot of the financial primitives that exist in traditional worlds: lending, leverage, derivatives, kind of opportunities to generate yield, and all the APIs are open. So it makes it a great training ground to try things first and not be um, drowning in maybe a lot of like the what I call like the integration hell and the operational reality of kind of working within the constraints and confines of traditional finance. So I think we're going to see a lot of, like, it's a great sandbox to try all these things. The fact that it's possible doesn't mean yet that it's something I advise everyone to do, because they do make mistakes, and those mistakes are a lot heavier and costlier than a coding agent, where um, the path back is deleting the code and asking it to go again.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. Man, that kind of is a good segue in terms of the difficulty of integration. I'm kind of curious about kind of the digital asset market kind of versus the more traditional financial AI. You know, digital asset markets can be one of the hardest markets for financial AI because they're always on, fragmented, and structurally noisy. Just kind of curious, what do you think? Does that, what does that environment expose, that traditional financial AI does not have the ability to solve, I guess. That does not have to solve, sorry.
I think so. Building anything in crypto in many ways is building it in hard mode in terms of like the risk, the volatility of the assets, the reality of the security. Um, Having everything open is great in some ways, but it's also kind of unprecedented. I think a lot of traditional finance teams or businesses have security by obscurity, but here you and the attacker have access to all your code. Um, we're seeing just a really crazy proliferation in nation-sponsored and state-sponsored attacks and very well-resourced adversaries. Um, and security has always been asymmetric, right? You can get like 99% of the things right. It just takes that 1% to wreak havoc. So in that sense, it's always been kind of on hard mode, and unfortunately, we see the reality of these exploits day in and day out. But taking like a broader stance on it, I think that finance and AI in finance is sort of like the canary in the coal mine, because whether you are building a portfolio, whether you are in medical and want to apply AI, cyber, or any other industry, you're going to face the same types of challenges, and you're going to need to build the same type of infrastructure. Maybe the application at the end is going to be different, but again, like finance is not the only high stakes industry. And this is where we kind of take the technology from something that is extremely promising and fun to play with, and take it to the last mile where it's something that can be used day in and day out in the most critical of situations.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And kind of, I think what you kind of are landing on is, that there is a very low risk tolerance for, financial AI. And yeah, there's some issues with security, and accuracy. So I'm kind of curious, like, what do you think? So if you're another a financial institution looking to trust AI with financial decision support or partial execution in digital assets, how you know, how ready, I guess, is the technology for most folks to adopt that technology, and or do we need more time to be able to get there before it's going to be a mainstream option for these financial institutions?
I think that like there's definitely low hanging fruit. So, customer success, someone's logged in out of their account and needs to do a recovery, doesn't know where to click on the UI. All those things are great places to start, but um, really to kind of build this well, you need to have like a high degree of aptitude in AI and also engineering. Like we always tell the team, to build a great AI app, you need to first build a great app, which most people struggle with, and then you also need to be great at AI and everything in between. So what I would say is this: I think that a lot of companies that we're speaking to have passed the honeymoon phase where they throw the team an open AI API key or Claude Code API key. Um, they see the token consumption and billing kind of skyrocket, and it's been 6 months, it's been 9 months, and everyone's hyped about it, but they're not able yet to execute. And kind of leadership starts to ask, we have 30 new line items on the budget, which didn't exist 2 years ago, but where is it translating into kind of like impact? So in order to circumvent that, I would highly recommend, similar to risk, similar to security, don't try to reinvent first principles within your company. This is a bleeding edge. Work with a team and tools that are tried and true, and kind of incrementally introduce it to the organization and start where the cost of being wrong is low. And as you gain more confidence and see what breaks, what works, and you have your insights and learnings, incrementally ramp it up.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, we definitely hear a lot of the difficulties of implementing AI pilots within corporate environments. A lot of it is how do you constrain it as much as possible to make it where you can succeed on very specific metrics. So it sounds like might be something similar to what you're talking about, not re wanting to reinvent the wheel on what you don't have to cut, what you don't have to touch. Kind of
Absolutely.
kind of related to that. Yeah, so in terms of the different layers, do you think that this agentic finance is kind of just a layer, a demo layer on top of that financial reasoning? Or do you think that we're actually at a stage where autonomous finance is becoming real infrastructure on its own?
I'll split it into two. Like there's the demo layer, and I think that in the history of humanity, I'm not sure there's ever been a technology that demos better, which is part of the excitement, because within a weekend, you can slap together a demo which looks really cool and gets everyone's interest peaked. But again, the gap between that and production is extremely large. There are organizations that are using it with success today, but these are really the organizations that have always been at the forefront of the technology. Similarly, they're usually pretty quiet about how they're using these technologies and where they're using these technologies. And even across those organizations, they're learning in production and scaling up the experimentation. So I think that we're going to get there because everyone sees what's on the other side of this,
Yep.
and that's real. Um, and it's like one of those things where people like overestimate what can be done in a year and underestimate what can be done in 5. Like it's also the rate of improvement and the slope of improvement and the acceleration is faster than anything I've seen in my lifetime. So while there is a big gap today, I'm confident that over the next 24, 36, 48 months, we're going to see more and more successful use cases in production, in finance, and elsewhere too.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm kind of curious on that topic. So you also mentioned before about having these pilots within companies and getting results. I'm kind of curious, like, when will we know that this financial AI is working, right? That it's trustworthy. Is there a test that we will know, like, okay, we're at that stage where we're ready to implement this at a wide scale?
I don't think that it's going to be a binary like checkpoint where before there was doubt and after there wasn't. Growing up, the test that we always used to speak about was the Turing test, and we kind of quietly blew through that very quickly. And the Turing test was, could a human determine whether or not it was speaking to another human or to an AI? Well, we sailed through that one, and since then we're inventing newer and newer benchmarks to try and assess the intelligence and capability of these models. Um, but there's a lot of kind of benchmark saturation and overfitting on these things as well. So those aren't also the best kind of, they're directionally correct, but not necessarily the best indicators for the state of it. I think the only real way to know, none of this is deterministic unless some of the architectures change and there's some type of formal verification or harness that you apply on top. It never will be deterministic. And really, the best way to gain confidence is um, to do the work, build your evals, build your benchmarks, test rigorously, have a very strong harness and guardrails. If you're seeing something that is high stakes and you haven't seen before, you haven't tested, it's okay for the model or the agent to reject it or to hand it off to a human. So all those things are important too. And I think it's just going to be like this arc of incremental wins, incremental steps, and versus like a binary check mark where today we can trust it and yesterday we couldn't.
Mhm. Definitely. Well, I think it's certainly telling that you're saying that you've already blown past the initial benchmarks that you had and kind of coming up with new benchmarks. That says something in terms of where we are in the state of for financial AI. I think we just have time for one last question here, and this is looking forward. Since you have a lot of experience, obviously, in this space the past few years, looking ahead for the next 3 to 5 years, what do you think is the stack for autonomous finance and digital assets? And secondly, what part of that stack would be the most hardest problem to solve?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's just recognizing that the finance is like very broad, right? Like and very nuanced. If you're doing portfolio management, if you're managing your treasury, if you're optimizing, P&L and budget, those are all very different problems. They need to be addressed as such. Um, so that's number one. I think that the kind of biggest step towards reaching kind of that level of autonomy across whatever the use case is really going to be developing that practice of building evaluation sets and benchmarks. Interestingly enough, like even if you go to like a business that's been operating for a few decades and you ask team leads or executives to kind of for a given flow, what are the 20, 30, 40 questions that you expect to receive and what does the ideal outcome look like? That's something that people really struggle with. They might know it intuitively, but translating that intuition into something that's structured that a machine or an agent can work with is not a muscle that really exists.
Mhm.
Once that's done, it's far easier to hill climb. But this is something that like even data scientists struggle with today and AI researchers. So it's going to need to diffuse across the economy, and an intuition will need to be built. But once you can define the problem, you can attack it, and you can see great results. I think that's the number one blocker to realizing like autonomous finance today.
Love it.
And
Well,
of course, would be regulation, right? Because that is actually probably the main blocker. Because is an agent a registered investment advisor? Is it regulated? What happens if the agent tells you to buy SpaceX and it drops 30% after the IPO? So that's also going to be something that, even if the technology is ready, I expect that to take longer than the technology itself.
love it. Yeah, so that might be the big challenge side of it that you were talking about. Okay. Well, Omer, well, I think it's a great note to end on here. I think we've covered a lot of the challenges, the excitement, the progress in autonomous finance. Really appreciate you making the time. Omer, it's really, really valuable conversation.
Thank you, Ben. Really enjoyed it. Thanks for taking the time as well. Appreciate it.